If you're a big Sonic fan, there's a good chance that you already know who Ian Flynn is. If you're not a Sonic fan, then I'm very sorry for everything our community puts you through. Anyway, Flynn is a writer for a ton of different series, but his work for the Sonic franchise is probably what he's most famous for. He wrote for the Archie Sonic comics for years before moving on to the IDW Sonic comics, the current comics for the franchise and the only ones that have ever held the distinction of being canon to the mainline games. It seems as if Sega has enjoyed working with Flynn over the years, as they've been giving him more and more projects to write for the Sonic series. He graduated from writing for supplementary material to writing for Sonic Frontiers itself a few years ago, making him a pretty important creative for the franchise. After years of working on other IPs like Minecraft, Archie, TMNT, and My Little Pony, it appears that Flynn got tired of only ever getting to work with other people's characters and concepts. For quite some time now, he's been trying to get his own IP off the ground, working with IDW Sonic artist Adam Bryce Thomas, and after a ton of work, they finally got the first volume of Dragoon Fortune's Lap to print, and it's a ton of fun. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Cool backstory and all, but what's the comic about? It's a bit difficult to pin it down, but I think the best 4-second pitch I can give for the comic is it's Cowboy Bebop, but set in the future of D&D instead of the future of our own world. It's a spacefaring adventure with a group of poor mana hunters aboard their ship, the Fortune's Lap, as they try to evade the law because lore. I could spend a lot of time just explaining the world and how everything works. In fact, much of this first volume is obviously dedicated to doing some serious world building to get the audience acquainted with the new setting. Personally, I don't find discussing world building in a vacuum to be all that interesting, but world building can do a lot to make a story feel more tangible. The world that Flynn and ABT have dreamt up here is really well thought out and cohesive from what we've seen so far. The TLDR is that there are 6 different realms separated by the ether, which is like space but poisonous. These realms are basically just planets, but they may be more akin to pocket dimensions. We'll have to see. The cosmos is ruled over by the Galaxan, which is kind of like the Catholic Church but evil. They worship the Dragoon, a mysterious race of nearly godlike beings that apparently created the universe before permanently dipping. Anything related to the Dragoon is considered holy and tightly controlled by Galaxan, including any Dragoon stragglers who got left behind. This leads into what I think is the comic's biggest strength, its characters. Wind, our protagonist, is one of the last Dragoon left in the 5 known realms, and before she and her crew found Indalise, she thought she was the last. Because the Dragoon are sacred or whatever, she's actively being hunted by Galaxan in order to do something bad. Probably capturing her and trying to use her godlike powers for their own purposes based on what the comic's shown so far, but they haven't explicitly said anything yet. Wind is reckless and foolhardy, but incredibly good-natured. She goes out of her way to help those around her whenever possible, but is definitely a bit of a show-off and has a very hard time listening to anyone she sees as an authority figure. Oh, and also she can turn into a dragon. That's not really relevant right now, but yeah, she can do that. This is a good spot to go to the other most heavily featured character in this volume, Foreign. As you can see, he's a dog-like person called an Aj in universe. Foreign is the analytical type and more often than not the source of most of the comic's exposition. He's the straight man to Wind's nonsense, focused on the mission and trying to keep them all alive and kicking for a few more days. The conflict between Wind and Foreign is one of the biggest beats in this volume actually, and the way it's handled tells you a ton about these characters. I'm gonna take a tiny detour real quick as this leads into one of my favorite interactions in the volume. Throughout this entire comic, Wind repeatedly acts in incredibly reckless ways that backfire on her and everyone else aboard the ship. Eventually, Foreign has had enough of this and starts an argument with Wind about her approach. Foreign says that Wind needs to show some restraint, and that makes Wind explode. She yells that she's always restrained. She has to hide who she is in public. She has to make sure she doesn't fight too hard or she might kill somebody. But if she doesn't fight hard enough, she won't be able to save the people she cares about. She asks Foreign if he thinks it's easy to live like that, and he says that he knows that it isn't. The conversation ends there and the comic moves on, but the argument really stood out to me for a couple of reasons. For one, it's a really good way of giving Wind a bit more depth. It's easy to think when first reading this comic that Wind is just a very reckless character. That's just a personality trait she has and she isn't aware of the consequences her actions have. However, this one conversation completely flips that perception of Wind on its head. Wind is keenly aware of the consequences of her actions. In fact, she's thinking about them constantly, and that's kind of the problem. This seemingly sets up Wind's character struggles throughout the rest of this comic in just a few lines, and I also do like that it sidesteps what would be an obvious but kind of boring plot beat to have. The whole trope of the reckless character who has to learn to hold back has been done so many times that it really has gotten boring, and I think this direction has much more depth than a simple look before you leap message. The other thing that stuck out to me about this particular conversation was that Foreign at no point didn't understand what Wind was going through. I get the feeling that this conversation is one they've had many times over the years. Foreign readily admits that what Wind is going through is unfair basically every time it comes up. Still, that doesn't negate the fact that her actions do make things more difficult for the rest of the crew, so it's easy to empathize with his position as well. Not to oversell the comic or anything, but the main thing that sticks out to me about Dragoon is how much thought seems to have been put into everything, even in just this one volume. Just from what we have so far, you learn a ton about the world, the characters, and what is most fascinating to me, the opinions that the characters have about that world. Wind and Foreign both feel that the state of the world is deeply unfair, while Jobun, we'll talk more about them in a minute, feels a bit more jaded. They probably agree, but they don't seem to feel the need to voice their displeasure about it as often. All of these little bits of attention to detail pile up and allow the comic to cultivate a verisimilitude, a feeling of authenticity that makes the setting easy to get sucked into. Anyway, we do need to cover the last couple of members of the Fortune's Lap crew. Next is Jobun, the captain of the ship. They're a Droff, a race of rock-like people. They also don't have sex or gender, though Jobun accepts the title uncle, so they're seemingly okay with being referred to by male titles. Or maybe Jobun just doesn't care about gender at all, which would be pretty based honestly. As stated earlier, Jobun is the most jaded of the group, seemingly the one who's been at this the longest. Their thing is that they constantly know a guy for whatever situation crops up. The last member of the crew is Lissy, or Indalise. She's also a Dragoon, though much younger than Wind. She acts like a child in a lot of ways, very bright and curious, and she thinks that the other members of the crew are super cool and sees all of them as her family. She's also seemingly wicked overpowered given a couple of things she does in this volume, but she's too young to use any of her Dragoon powers yet. Big child prodigy vibes here. There's a lot more I can just explain about this comic, but I don't want to replace the volume with this video. The main reason I'm making this video at all actually is because the comic is having a hard time finding its footing, at least financially. Flynn and ABT tried to get several publishers for the project who all shot it down, and so they eventually turned to self-publishing, a very difficult enterprise. And having gotten my hands on the finished product and seeing what it's all about, I can kind of understand how we got here. Starting a new IP is just really difficult these days, and most successful new IPs that I can think of have some sort of hook to get people invested as quickly as possible. For example, Frieren After Journey's End is a story about an elf who outlives her adventuring party and has to deal with the grief of exploring the new world that they saved alone. That is an instantly compelling pitch for a story, and it's a pitch that only really takes a single chapter of manga or episode of an anime to sell people on the series. Dragoon doesn't have an immediately compelling hook, and it is, like almost everything these days, derivative of works that came before it. It's hard to sell people on this comic without them just giving it a chance and seeing what it's all about for themselves. Hell, I only picked up the book because I knew about its creators and just wanted to see more of their work. I have a feeling that the comic is really going to have a hard time finding its audience. Not because it's a bad product, but because there's not exactly a ton in the way of advertising for it. And so this video is mostly meant to remedy that. I'd hate to see this story never be able to be told just because it's hard for it to catch on, you know? If you're a fan of any of Flynn's writing or just want a new comic to read, I highly suggest that you give the comic a chance if anything I've said so far sounds interesting at all. I think one of Flynn's main strengths as a writer is making comics that are really approachable and fun to read. The dialogue between his characters always flows great, and the way he writes the characters is just so charming. Seriously, my only experience with this IP is this volume of the comic, and I'm already invested in these characters. I've only had Wind in my life for 90 pages, but if anything happened to her, I would kill everyone in this room and then myself. Dragoon's website will be linked below, and the project does have a Patreon if you want to support it outside of just buying the volume. I know this is a pretty short video by my standards, but again, I don't want to overshadow the comic. It's a great read, and the impetus of this entire video is just letting people know that it exists. Anyway, while I'm shilling, please like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, and if you really want to support me, you can become a member to get access to my videos a day early and get shout out at the end of each one. Speaking of which, big shoutouts to Elric111, Agent B7, Joseph Florian, Shredding Pixels, GB484, Atria Gaming, Nicholas Goslin, Jojo Nono2, Pancone Queso, Noble Samurai, and CatMat7339.